Hello, everyone. Hello, Fred. Hello, Tyler. Hello, Honest. Hey, look, today I actually did an intro. Look at me fucking go. Oh, shoot, I'm not just supposed to swear this early into the stream. YouTube suppresses me if I do. Look at me go. Do you think it'll take that? Do you think it'll accept that? Oh, and hello, James. Do you think it'll accept that? I hope it does. I hope it does. Frick. I need to say frick. Anyways, I decided we're gonna talk about writing. I honestly was semi-inspired by what Chibs is doing later this week. Which is talking about like how to keep your audience like involved, entertained, and that's a matter of pacing. Kind of. So, but I think that's a really detailed work. And I wanted to speak in more generals because I think a lot of people, it's when it comes to writing, one of the I think a lot of people get a bad start and then try to work forward from there, but you're climbing up a mountain upside down. Does that make sense? And so that's why I want to start today by saying like, oh, hello, Void. You want food? We'll go get some. I'm not stopping you. I mean, I'm a damn snack right here. Did that wink work? There we go. Yes. Because, how do I put this? You've been in bed for 6 hours. Nice. That sounds good. Anyways, what I wanted to start with is something I've had to teach a lot of people, because I have actually given like a lot of writing advice. You know, I come from obviously a pretty heavy writing background. So I a lot of people come to me for advice. And if I've noticed anything, it's that people are starting in the wrong spot. And you're not going backwards. It's like that'd be like saying, oh, I want to rearrange my room. Well, first you gotta clean it. You're not going backwards by cleaning it. You're getting rid of clutter. There's less stuff in the room that you are looking to fill, but you're still making it easier for yourself to put good things in there. So I think to start out, what I want to say is like the key to getting started in writing is, and you can choose to believe me, you can choose to not, but it's writing prompts. And I actually think this is what makes a lot of people who write, this is both a strength and a weakness of fanfiction writers, at least in the beginning, is it starts you in an interesting spot. Give me a sec. I'm just going to move the mic with me as I give myself some better lighting. It starts you in an interesting spot. Because it starts you with the limitations of the universe that you're working in. But it also sometimes can give you almost a little too much freedom. Because you're working in an area you feel comfortable in. Here's the issue with being comfortable in art. If you're comfortable in art, it's really hard to notice your mistakes. Okay, for example, I like to write about horror. And this is definitely my weakest genre, period. Because I love horror. So anything I do in horror, I like a little bit, at the very least. Which makes me a horrible critique of my own work. I used to really like fantasy. So when I would write fantasy, I couldn't see what I was missing. And this was very early on. I don't like working in fantasy anymore. Due to a long list of reasons. But it essentially, it makes it harder to notice what you don't like about your writing. When you're working in a field you love. So that's kind of the issue, I think, with a lot of early writers is, write what you love is such a good piece of advice. But it's kind of like saying eat what you love and you've only ever eaten at McDonald's. Obviously, you're gonna just keep eating McDonald's. Which, in my opinion, is kind of an issue. Yes, and if you can have a friend, hence why you need a friend that is willing to read your work, and they're able to tell you an honest opinion. Yes, if you have a friend who is able to actually read your work and properly critique it, you have a blessing. Buy that person lunch, because that is a rare thing to come by. That is a rare thing to come by in my experience. Especially if that person, that itself can be rough, for the exact same reason I just listed. How do I put this? So, let's say you're writing Sherlock fanfiction. Random thing I just picked out. Trust me, never was a what's the word? A super hulock? I was never one of them. Let's say you're writing Sherlock fanfiction, right? Okay. You write a Sherlock fanfiction, and it happens to characterize Sherlock in a way that you and your friend really like, possibly because maybe you RP with them a lot, possibly be because you guys read a lot of the same fanfiction, possibly be because, why am I saying BB because? Possibly because you have a similar reading of the character in the show, right? Now, as long as you stay within that realm of Sherlock, someone who's a little less experienced will struggle to give a more complex reading of your work and a complex reading of your strengths and your weaknesses than someone who's not into that at all. Does that make sense? For the same reasons I listed, there's going to be so much that they do like, it can be hard to see the weakness in it. The brain will auto-complete characterization in a sense. It's actually like such an interesting tool to play with as a writer, is what the audience will figure out without you having to say anything at all. And it's a cultural factor. It's a cultural factor. And it's why some books just do not read well in different parts of the world. So when I speak to like the cultural factor of like the mental autocomplete of character, it's an essential part of writing. This is very I think this is much more complicated. So I don't want to linger on it too long. But yes, it's something you shouldn't start with, is what I'll say. You're gonna do it. It's pretty hard not to, but it's better to know how it works than it is to sort of hope it works out for you. And we'll go into how to handle that in a sec. Let me actually write that down. The auto-completion of characterization. Filling in the blanks of characterization. Hello, Rango. Welcome, welcome. We're talking about writing today, just because that's what I talk about a lot. And I was semi-inspired by a friend. Anyways, what was I talking about right before that? Yes, starting out. I'm already starting to write. Just notes, just you know, like Cliff's notes, essentially. Yes. So starting out, which is why, like, my number one piece of advice I give to everyone who wants to write, but hasn't published anything or done anything professional or taken any formal schooling in the matter, because schooling kind of does this for you. It's actually like writing school is, everyone says it's useless, but I heavily disagree. It's useful for the same reason most college/university is useful, in that it's very good at helping you find yourself. And it's very good at what we're mostly talking about today, which is helping you find your voice. Because what I recommend above all is exercises. They're all over the place. You can get a list of them on the internet. Yes, if applied correctly, that's a very good point, Rango. There's a list of them on the internet. There's books that I've bought that are just, oh, here's your writing prompt for the day, and or for the week, or you know, whatever you're working on, and it gives you a writing prompt. You spend maybe 2,000 words on it, maybe 10 pages, somewhere in that range. Honestly, even like 3 pages if you're feeling lazy that day, it's fine. Hell, a paragraph can help. But you know, save those for the days where you're really tired, if you ask me. I work at a pace of about, working on a project, I try to work at a pace of about 5 to 10 pages a day, and that's not edited. Editing for me is like way at the end. That's just how my brain works. The pages I output don't need heavy editing. I'm a pretty neat writer. I'm pretty clean. My final draft and first drafts are different. They have to be, trust me. But the core is the same. That just comes with experience. Anyways, yes, these writing character or word count. Good question. So the reason I say pages and not a word count is because I think it's more helpful to view your work in pages, both for your well, most of the time, because dialogue will fill up a page fast at a low word count, obviously. But I personally believe dialogue to be a much more challenging thing to write than a paragraph of, you know, description and the sort. Because dialogue has to do so much with voice and capturing voice, it can be a lot more work intensive. So I would work yourself. Oh, okay. Classic word dimensions, you know, 1-inch margins, 12-point font times New Roman is what you should always be working in when you're in your draft phase. Don't get fancy. Never get fancy. Never, when you're in draft, if you start fucking with your goddamn fonts, you're lost. You're gone. The project is dead. Quit now. Seriously. Like that is such a red flag for process. That needs to be the very last thing you consider. Thank you for bringing that up, James. This is actually like, I do want to talk about to some degree things like that in terms of the creative process, like what I call death flags for your work, because there's these traps in the creative process that anyone, myself included, can get stuck in. And I've talked about them, how they exist within speculative fiction, and how each speculative genre within speculative fiction has its own traps that you can get caught in. But there are general writing traps as well. If you're adjusting font sizes and you're fucking with your italics and you are in your first draft, you don't want to write this. You just don't. You don't like what you're making. So either start over or get really serious. Those are your two paths. At that point, you're wasting your own time. Writing good villains. We can put that in the docket for the day. We'll get to that. So that's why, anyways, back to the exercises. So after you've been working exercises for some time, you know, little writing prompts. Like here, I'll even search some up right now. And I'll tell you guys the ones that tend to work for me. You don't have to do every single one you see. A lot of them are bad. Like this one. Make a mysterious message an important part of your story. That's horrible. That's a horrible prompt. Ugh, I'm leaving that page. I'm also drinking, so the quality of my opinions will come over time. This is a good one. Okay, let's go through this. Outside the window. What's the weather outside your window doing right now? If that's not inspiring, what's the weather like somewhere you wish you could be? Personally, I like the first half of that one. What is the weather outside your window doing right now? What story does the weather give? That is a really good exercise because it begins to teach you about atmosphere. And it teaches you to go outside your comfort zone. That's actually one of the greatest issues I see with new authors is there's this saying in writing, write what you know. And I think people have interpreted that a little incorrectly over time, is what I will say. Because how do I put this? Writing what you know, I don't think it means what a lot of new authors think it means. It typically means write what's emotionally true to you, would be a better way to put that. Whoever came up with that saying is a writer in their own right, I have no doubt, because they're writing it in a very writer-esque way. Write what is emotionally true to you, which is hard to figure out. Like, for example, if I was me, I am me, I probably wouldn't want... no, let's not use me as an example. I'm not a good example. Let's go. Yes, actually, James, that's a really good way. It can lead to not learning new things and tools to write with. Playing with your atmosphere, playing with what characters you're writing can challenge you. It can challenge you in very new and interesting ways. Because what I think a lot of people don't realize is just how much they do know. How much the people around you have leached into who you are, and how you can take those pieces and splay them across the page. Good. So anyways, what you'll do is you'll do exercises like this. You'll write about the weather and you'll find a story that suits it. In my advice, and I say this a lot, write realism first. Please, please, please. If you take anything from me, it's to write realism first. Here, let's look at some other ones. The vessel. Write about a ship or other vehicle that can take you somewhere different from where you are now. That's another good one, and it causes a lot more introspection, which introspection is core to the art of writing. You need to be able to look at yourself and know yourself. Because I hate to say it, every character, every scene, everything, that's you. That's you on the page. You have to be comfortable with that level of vulnerability, with you being on there and people possibly not liking it. It's you have to cut yourself open like a bit. If you feel scared and uncomfortable to have people read it, not because what if they think it's good, but because what will they think about me after they read this, you are on the right track. If your writing has you wondering, will this change people's opinion of me? You are on the right track with your work, especially in the early phases. That's good advice. Because that means that you're writing from the heart. It means you're writing vulnerable. If if one of the notes you receive back is, oh, it reminds me of one of your key influences, you're probably on the wrong track, I hate to say. And I'm not looking to take you down. I'm not looking to speak down to you. It just means you're a little bit climbing up the mountain backwards. If you're a big Stephen King fan and someone reads your work and says, oh, this reminds me a lot of Stephen King, if you're in your early phases, you're probably on the wrong track, because it means you're not writing, because part of being a writer is reading between the lines of the criticism you get and trying to understand what people are actually pulling from your work. Because as I said earlier, to Tyler, people will rarely give you genuine criticism. It's quite a rarity. It's always going to be influenced by their own lens, and if they're good friends with you, then they're good friends with your work, plain and simple. And it's hard to tell a good friend that they're doing something wrong. Anyways, so yeah, you need to be able to read the lines in between, but that's a skill that will come with time. Just listen, pay attention to what people say and how they say it, which is why I say that if someone says, oh, this reminds me of this, it means you've entered, it can mean, it not does mean, but it can mean that you've entered the realm of derivative work, which means you're not speaking with your own voice. This is not emotionally vulnerable for you. Yeah. I guess the other half of that is how you feel you respond to it. If they say, oh, this reminds me of blank, and you get excited, that means you still have a way to go. But if you get hurt, if you're physically wounded by it, you do still have a way to go, but you're at least, I think, facing the right direction. Like, oh shoot, I really thought I was speaking with my own voice. I really thought blank, blank, blank. That's what that can mean. At least I'm once again here speaking from my own experience. So, grain of salt, everyone. Maybe I'm just revealing a lot about myself. I feel uncomfortable right now, so I am being vulnerable. Anyways. Welcome back, Grim. Anyways. Okay. So yes, once you have these exercises, read over your own work. That's another important step. Read your work. You will always be your greatest critic. For the good and bad, really, quite genuinely. Sometimes you'll notice something that does not matter, and you just need to let it go. I'm going through that with this project right now. There's a detail that no one else has noticed, but I've noticed, and it's key to this one goddamn moment, and I know it's there, and I just haven't figured out how to fix it. No one has said anything. No one has an issue with it. I even ask people, and they go, I don't get that, but I know it's there. So before I submit it for awards, I need to clean that up for my sake. And I'm banging my head into the wall trying to figure out how. Anyways. What was I saying? Yes. Read over your own work. Find what your strengths are. Find the parts that ring for you. There will be some. And if a part isn't ringing, don't comfort yourself. Hello, Vern. Congratulations, Boyd, on getting food. Don't comfort yourself by saying, well, stories drag, stories pick up, da-da-da-da-da. You need to come back to that section that you're not as fond of. Don't accept your own shortcomings by taking the average level of your work. Don't be like, well, there's moments that are 10 out of 10 and there's moments that are 3 out of 10. It's kind of a 7 overall. Go back to those moments that are 3s. Don't accept that. Don't accept that for yourself. There's always a way to enhance it, always a way to bring it up, and always more point to be made. Anyways. What was I saying? Yes. Look over your own work. Find your strengths. In those strengths, find what about those moments that you like were your strongest moments. Okay? For me, personally, I am very good at dialogue. It's one of my strengths, period. I have a very good way of capturing voice. It's very snappy. It tends to bleed between the sort of hyper-realistic style and a more flowery, I would say, like postmodern style in a sense. Once again, this is me looking at my own work, so I'm gonna hype it up. And that is the reviews I consistently get is towards my dialogue, the strength of my dialogue. I do love my prose, but my dialogue is one of my key strengths, I would say. And you're not gonna be good at everything. That's one thing you need to accept about yourself right now. I know I just said, like, go back and fix what's wrong, but also, like, accept your weaknesses. That's a paradox, and get used to that. Get used to that. You're gonna go through that a lot. Anyways, so find your strengths, and then find genres, mediums, and stories that work with that. You know what I mean? If your strength is dialogue, do not write a piece that exists entirely with one character never speaking to anyone. Do not write a piece about nature. Do not if your strength is dialogue, never write about nature. Don't do it. You're gonna fuck it up. Like, do it, but like realize that it's gonna come up short, and you're gonna have to do a lot of drafts, and you're gonna have to grow. Don't ever try to sell it, I guess. Use it as practice. So, find your strengths, separate them from your weaknesses, figure out how to highlight those strengths, create those strong moments, and avoid those lows. Avoid, if you're like, oh wow, I do a lot of long paragraphs that are kind of rambly and very prose heavy and hyper flowery. Just accept that that may not be the style that works best for you right now. You might grow into it in the future, you might get better, all possible, all good. But accept that at least for right now, you need to focus on where you are strong. Sorry, gonna take a drink. And grow that. Grow from your strengths. Build around it. Layer, let's say, once again, you're good at dialogue. Layer description, layer story. Have it flow with your dialogue. Finding flow is going to be one of your most consistent challenges. And finding how your words flow is going to be one of your most consistent challenges. When you have a flow, I wish I had a way of telling you that you just know that you can look at it and know that it flows. No, I wish. But you will get a feel for it over time. It's a sense, much like touch, much like taste, much like a sense of balance. It's a sense that develops. And it'll be a sense of your own work and when you're in your element. And when you're not. Which you're going to get a feel for over time. You're going to look at your own work and go, no, that... Like, I have a personal... Like, to speak on one of my sort of tricks I use, and something that bugs me, is the conversational switch up is something I've never liked. It's sometimes to a fault, because I just don't... I find it like a miracle when in a show, people will be like, oh, you hear the elephants are coming to town? And then they have a fight about the elephants. And then at the end of that conversation, someone will go, let's go get burgers. That's something... Oh, that actually sounds good, actually. I could make that work. Okay, but when someone switches topics in a conversation and we leave something behind and move on to the next beat without switching scenes or without switching locations, that screws me up. That's my biggest challenge to figure out how to work as a writer. Oh, good. You had burgers for supper. I hope they were delicious. I hope they were lightly rare in the middle and nice and crispy. I'm not much of a burger guy. I hope that's what people like. Welcome, Vesper. Welcome. So finding that flow, finding what works for you as a writer. For me, it leads to a style of dialogue, which that's why I do. Oh, and Psycho as well. Welcome, welcome. That's what leads to a style of dialogue that sort of defines my work, is the lack of those switch ups, the lack of that conversational. Suddenly we're talking about something else. Without the first thing is resolved, and now we're talking about something else. Because I just don't find that to be realistic to the human experience. And yes, it's literature, it's not meant to be realistic, but it doesn't lead to a grander truth for me. So I don't love it. I just don't love it. Because I find people linger. I find conversations meander, and sometimes people repeat themselves. And very rarely is someone willing to let go of something within a single conversation. So for my work, what that means is that nothing is settled with a cathartic end, which is just part of my style. Characters will back off for a moment. Characters will step to the side. Characters will focus on what's more important. They won't incessantly, repeatedly talk about the same thing over and over and over and over and over again. But they will come back to it when they see the opportunity. And that, a lot of critics like that in my work. A lot of critics don't like that in my work. Some people say it's repetitive and cyclical. Some people say it's realistic and grounded. You know, take what you will out of that. But that's what I mean. And that's something I found by reading my own work and being like, oh, this conversational switch up is necessary for the story, but I fucking hate reading it. I just can't stand how it reads. I can't stand how it sounds. What happened to what they were talking about before? Where was all that energy? Are we just going to dissipate it with one big final dramatic quotable line? Ugh, that feels wrong. That feels so Saturday morning. Thank you, Psycho. And it just wasn't what my style was. And I found that by doing these exercises and by going back to them and seeing what I didn't like, and then incorporating what I didn't like and finding a different route, which for me is like much more based in theater, actually. Like the style of dialogue that I do is much more based on stage. In terms of like focusing on switching tactics, focusing on switching ideas, and then allowing other characters to use that as leverage to pull it in other directions, which is much more close to what it's like in real life. So yeah, that's what I learned. Only one thing that I learned from doing these exercises. What I will say is, when you find your voice, when you find your flow, some people call it voice, some people call it flow. I'm always torn on which one to call it. For me, it feels more like flow. It feels like river. Like a river, like the land. It feels natural when you start writing in your own voice. It'll pour out of you like water. And that's why I always call it flow. I've never seen anyone who hasn't found their flow. We're talking about all sort of like getting started as a writer and like the idea of how to find your voice. Sorry. What we've gone over thus far is the necessity of exercises, those daily writing prompts or weekly writing prompts that you don't necessarily want to write about. Because when you're working in areas you don't like, you're so much quicker to notice your flaws than when you're working in areas that you do. I go more into detail of that back in the VOD. Yes, and essentially this comes down to, as a writer, you have to pull yourself out of your comfort zone. Because if you're comfortable, you're never going to do your best work. And I've said this a lot. I've said this all the time. An artist who is comfortable is an artist who has given up. You've reached a level you're comfortable with, and you never aim to ascend past that. you need to be uncomfortable with what you're doing. I hate to say it. From an emotional standpoint, you need to be uncomfortable. From a intellectual standpoint, you need to be uncomfortable. Yeah. But since we're starting in the beginning, you first need to know what makes you comfortable, what you're the best at, what comes naturally to you. That's what you need to know. And there is a degree of uncomfort here, because I don't think that people's strengths are always what they want them to be. I don't think that people's strengths are always what they want them to be. Some people want to write fantasy, but maybe they should be writing realism. Some people want to write sci-fi, but they should be writing realism. Some people want to write horror, but they should be writing realism. Basically, what I'm saying is you should be writing realism right now. Do it. Pull out a page and talk about a lonely girl on the prairies, staring out at a setting sun, thinking about having to go to work tomorrow. Write that. If you can make that interesting to you, what I just said, then you can do it. Then you can do anything in writing. If you can take that, make that compelling to you without sticking aliens, a fantasy portal to another world, a sword of some kind, any combat, a monster on the distant fields. If you can take that scene and make that interesting, then you're genuinely in a good spot. Writing, that's one of the biggest things to challenge yourself early on. Oh, that's funny. Good little write-up. Okay, that's a good note, Vesper. We'll talk about that, actually. So, the easiest way I can say this is BJ Novak didn't know that he wanted to write like BJ Novak. He didn't start writing saying, I'm going to be exactly like BJ Novak. I'm going to write everything BJ Novak. I'm going to write stories exactly like BJ Novak. He just started writing, and that's how he found his voice. Like, it's entirely possible that's within you, that's what suits you. But sometimes what we like to read isn't what we are good at writing. This isn't me saying you exactly. This just is a good example. And it's also what I mean by getting uncomfortable. Okay. I'm drinking for a sec. Maybe you are, like, that style will suit you. And you can work within that, because comedic realism is a delightful. The thing about BJ Novak is he does have, like, understanding is also key in sense of, like, Mr. Novak, love his work, plays with surrealism in one area, like just one, which is he works in surrealist dialogue, and that actually definitely comes from his experience working and writing for sitcoms. Because his dialogue is direct in a very surreal and inauthentic way, but it keeps the emotional authenticity, which works very well for One More Thing, because it is a short story book, so he can tackle more complicated and layered issues in short periods of time. You know what actually also did that quite recently? That exact same thing that I'm talking about? The Barbie movie did that incredibly recently, in terms of, like, surrealist, hyper, like, direct dialogue, because, like, one of the key pieces of writing, one of the key pieces of advice that any writer will give you is no one ever tells you what they want. Ever. If a character says exactly what they want, they're lying. Or they're trying to push you in a direction because they actually want something else. It is very rare that a character will come on stage and say, or come onto the page, or come onto the screen and say, this is what I want. That's what makes BJ Novak so hilarious, is his characters do that very frequently. And it's also why it's really good, if you like his work, to watch Vengeance. Give me a sec here, chat. There we go. It's really good to watch Vengeance, because Vengeance is a fantastic example of him defying his own conventions, in a sense. So, sorry, I'm pausing myself. I don't know why. Yes. Yeah, check out Vengeance. It's a film, and he defies a lot of his own conventions, and you see how he writes outside of that sort of safety of a short story with very direct characters. The Barbie movie, like I said, did it a lot recently in terms of characters literally will just say what they want. Just very directly. Which gives you more room for the theoretical. Regardless of your opinions on it. It definitely achieves that. Which allows them to get a lot more complicated with their ideology and a lot more layered with their how do I put this? With their themes. That's a good way of putting it. So yes. That's like a very specific technique I'm talking about right here. I wouldn't go out of my way to write something with that in mind. That is more something you'll find occurring naturally as you work on a specific project. And don't worry, I won't be talking about the Barbie movie. I won't be spoiling it. Anyways, so, yes. Look at your own writing. Find what works in it. And then once you're very comfortable with what you are good at, which is really hard to figure out. It will take a long time. And it'll work best if you do it, as I said, in things you're not necessarily excited to write. You know, what do they always say? The love of the craft, right? You have to love the act of writing, not simply the act of creation. That's a big one, and it's kind of heady. So we're going to take a moment, I think, to talk about that. I think a lot of people don't love writing. I think they love having something wrote. Something written? Something written. I think they love the act of having something written. They don't love writing. They love their story. And if that's the case, you will run into problems later, to say the least. You have to, that's why I recommend exercises. That's a genuine part, is because you have to learn the love of the craft itself, rather than simply the love of telling a story. And those are different things. Well, the art of telling a story is the same as writing, but just rather than just loving your story. If you love your story, the first question you have to ask is this the medium that it best exists in? The second question you have to ask is why you are writing it. And this sounds really basic, but hear me out. So, understanding why you've chosen to write what you're writing is very important. It's an essential part of the process, actually. Understanding why you're working on what you're working on is as important as understanding what you're working on. Because if you are writing this for no reason other than a vague love of the story in your mind, you're going to run into a lot more walls over time, especially if the story is incomplete. And most stories are incomplete. Most stories that people think that they have ready to go, they have it in their mind, and they just have to put it on the page, are incomplete. With very few exceptions are these stories not incomplete. Because connecting the dots, because the story in your head exists in a hyper compressed space someone cannot keep a whole novel in their mind. There are probably a few people, but most people can't. And connecting the dots between the points, when you decompress it, when you stretch that out, it's like stretching out like bubble gum. Holes begin to form, and finding how to fill those holes and reconnect those moments will be a challenge. It'll be a pretty heavy one, actually. And that's where the love of the craft needs to come into play. Because otherwise those holes will become pits that you fall into, and then you start changing fonts and playing with bold and italics and changing absolutely nothing of what you've written, but rewriting the title 80 times, spending 4 hours on your character Bible that didn't need to be done yet because it's within a single novel, and the novel is the character Bible in a sense. It's only when you're working, you know, with multiple people and there's multiple segments of something that you really need something like that. It's when you start, God, if you start writing your sequel instead of finishing what you are working on, you will find yourself in a hole. Yes, and that's where, okay, I'll talk about both of these. James Patterson says to write a detailed outline of every chapter. I don't disagree with that to some degree. That is a process question. Writing an outline, most people don't understand how useful it is. And it's one of the most bitter parts of writing. So writing an outline is essential to the process because it will help you connect those dots. It will help you figure out where you go from what to what. And just reading over the outline, you'll begin to notice where the holes are, and your brain will start having time to fill those in rather than just starting to write. Here's the catch. I know a lot of writers who will write an outline and one of two things will happen. One, they become obsessed with the outline. It is hyper detailed, it is borderline a novel within its own right, and they never write the novel, they just keep editing the outline. That's gonna kill ya. That's gonna kill ya. That's gonna destroy you. Becoming obsessed with your outline because you're like, oh, I could change this and this will work better. You don't know that. You don't know what's gonna work better until you write it. If you took stories and flattened them to their outline and said they are made or broken based on just their outline, there's a lot of amazing stories out there which would never work. It's all about the execution. So don't become obsessed with a perfect outline. 2, they write an outline and the opposite occurs. They become obsessed with the outline staying the same. I've already written it. It worked. I never have to change it. Even though I'm being pulled in this direction, I wrote this scene and this character just popped out to me in a way that he had never popped out before, and I don't have a dedicated section for him next, but I feel like it's his time, but I didn't write that into my outline. How will I ever do this? You can change it. You can change it. You can just do something different. Those are the two major faults I find with new writers and outlines. That being said, an outline is still a very useful tool that will help you work in actually a few ways. One, it will help you write in what needs to be next. So one of the challenges of writing is not writing for today, but writing for tomorrow. Knowing what the next scene you write will be and how you can intertwine those two scenes together. Because I do a very, very intense first draft. That tends to be something that kills me. That's one of my weaknesses, is I'm obsessed with a good first draft. So I will try to write for tomorrow. And I shouldn't necessarily do that, because like you can always write for today and then come back in and edit tomorrow in. And by that I mean foreshadowing, by that I mean consistent character arcs and evolution. That can all be done in the second draft, or the third, honestly, a lot of the time, or sometimes the fourth. That can all be brought back in later. If you can, if all you can fit in your brain is today, then write for today. And two, but an outline helps you do a little bit of that from the onset. If you know the character in this scene is going to do X, and you know in the next scene he's going to do Y, then maybe by the end of the scene, he does a little Y. Just a little. And it's not focused on. You don't spend a lot of time on it. But it's a little bit there. Or alternatively, if by the end of the piece he is Z, and at the start he is X, maybe you start to figure out where to put the Y in the outline. That's one of the strengths of an outline. The second strength of an outline is you can write out of order, which I really recommend. There's nothing worse and nothing better. There's nothing worse when writing than to not be able to continue working that day because you are currently stuck on a very difficult scene, a very difficult chapter, and then and get nothing done when you could have been working on chapter 8. Maybe you're on chapter 5 and you're stuck, but chapter 8, you know how it's gonna go. So you just skip ahead. You write chapter 8 today. And maybe in a later draft, chapter 8 gets a massive rework, because honestly, what were you thinking by jumping ahead like that? Like I currently have to do. But maybe it works out. Either way, yes. The second thing I wanted to talk about, connecting the dots. Okay. This is a big one, so it's a little hard to tackle. I would say if you are struggling currently with connecting the dots in your story, you need to look at your characters a little bit closer, would be my advice. Because it does depend in what you're working right now, but characters drive the plot. And by that, I mean when you write a scene, you need to understand your characters to the point where you know where they're going next. And if you manage that, the evolution of your story will become as natural as breathing. If you understand who your characters are and why they're doing what they're doing and how they would react to the situations you've put them in, then it will begin to flow. It will begin to work. Would be possibly the best advice I could give for that exact situation. Yeah. Hello, dead man. Welcome. That would be what I would say. Which can be difficult. Finding your voice is only one part of it. If you find your voice, it'll help you find your characters' voices, is what I will say. Why was that message censored on my Twitch chat, on my on-screen chat? That's weird. You just said hello. And how to better understand your characters. One thing I find that helps me understand my characters and work with them is, at least in the first draft, extend your intro. Your introduction to these characters. Write a lot about their domestic lives, about their lives at home. Write them in a more realistic and grounded scenario. What are you trying to write, Vesper? Let's actually do this. Let's start going through what everyone's currently struggling with, and I'll try to offer the advice that I can. I'll actually take this opportunity to go back to, I do believe it was Void earlier who said, like, villain advice. I hope you're still here, Void, because I'm about to talk about it. How to write a good villain. Now, I think there is a bit of a fallacy in this in terms of separation between villain and protagonist. When you're writing a good villain, it's no different than writing any other character. You are writing a person. One of the best pieces of advice I can give is every single person, with rare exception, is the hero of their own story. They have a reason for what they're doing. They have a passion behind what they're doing. And they have a belief that what they are doing is fundamentally the right thing. How to write a sociopath? God, read American Psycho and realize that that's a waste of time. And that they just make uninteresting characters. Fucking Americans. Fuck you, Bret Easton Ellis. Understanding your villain. Because there's, I guess, a couple different schools of thought here. I tend to fall into the realm of the more not personality, motivated villains, I guess one could say. There's a lot of love right now for the Disney villain, but people don't really understand that Disney villains have motivation. They have internals. They have drive, and they do believe that they're, doing the right thing. Except for maybe Jafar, but like Ursula feels slighted by Triton. Scar feels slighted by Mufasa, and so forth. So these characters, even though their motivations are simpler, do still have motivation. They have goals. They just have less getting in the way between them and their goals, in terms of morals or what's right or wrong. That's what I mean about like every character every character thinks they're doing the right thing does not mean every character thinks they are morally justified. Sometimes that means a character thinks that what they're doing is wrong, but they deserve it. They deserve it despite it being wrong. So that's why my core advice to writing a good villain is to simply treat them as you would every other character. They need to be as detailed as your protagonist. Now, here's where it gets really hard. Depending on the perspective from which your story is told, this can get difficult. Okay? For a lot of stories, the villain will be on camera, we'll say. Camera on stage, on camera, in scene, for a drastically smaller amount of time than your protagonist. Like a lot smaller. So you need to get there quick. You need to get to the point with them fast. This does not mean writing an entire chapter where we see the villain's sad, tragic backstory. But you need to get both more subtle and more direct. In terms of subtlety, once again, the villain's not going to walk into the scene and say, "Hey, I'm evil because my mother made me wear a sailor's outfit for 10 years. No, but they're probably going to have a passion for choice. They're probably, let's use this exact scenario. Let's say the villain's mother made them wear a sailor's outfit for 10 years straight. They're probably going to have a passion for freedom. They're going to have an aversion to the female figures in your story. You could play with that, but let's just go general. They're going to have, at the very least, a complicated relationship with women. And they're going to have a passion for freedom. What is their ultimate goal here? Let's say their ultimate goal is to, I don't know, what would a villain who had this experience be? What would they want? That's one of your first questions. What do they want? What are they willing to do for it? And why do they want it? That's a good one. Actually, Dr. Freeze is a good example here. You know, he was fighting for his passions. Well, I don't know. With Dr. Freeze, you get like the villain breakdown moment, which can be powerful, but honestly, I think super overplayed in modern literature. Everyone wants to write the next Mr. Freeze, Dr. Freeze, where you get that moment of the dead wife reveal. But you can insinuate it in much more subtle ways. You can have your characters suggest what they actually want, and the audience won't necessarily fully understand why they're doing what they're doing, but they will see a proper character. They will see someone with goals and something that seems to be motivating them. They will see the full portrait of a person, and that is what will drive them. So yeah, how much time you spend with your villain can change. I recommend in the current landscape, avoiding too much would be my advice. Because everyone wants to do the villain with a dead, you know. Yes, exactly, Rango. Misunderstood villains have been very cookie cutter and formulaic. They don't have to be misunderstood to still feel like they're right. They can be understood. They can be entirely comprehended, but just incomprehensibly wrong would be a good way to put it. And you can see that in some classic Disney villains. And in a lot of stories, really. You can have your black and whites. You can have your definely wrong villains. As long as you understand why they're wrong. What led them to being wrong. It can exist. They do not have to be completely without depth to avoid that trend. Would be something I would say. Okay. Now let's dive into what Vesper was just saying. Okay, they meet X character here. They encounter Y enemies, da-da-da-da-da. Okay. Then I would say currently, if I may, you're approaching things from kind of the wrong starting point here. Because right now your story isn't character driven in a sense. There are purely plot driven stories where a list of events happen to a character, but for that you still need motivation between the events. Why do they meet X character here? Why do they meet Y character here? Why do they fight here? In that case, you can actually play with the villain a lot more. Maybe it's the villain causing these events. Who knows? But you need a motivation that drives the story, and it can't be your own. It has to be something internal to the world. Is it they need to get from X point on the map to Y point on the map? You know, classic Lord of the Rings. That's fine. You know what I mean? If it's just like they need to get from X to Y, sorry, let's go A to Z. That works a little better here. If they need to go from A to Z, then you better come up with a hell of a good alphabet in the middle. But you need to understand where they're going. No. You need to understand the progression. Why they go from one part to the next. Are they being strung along by a villain? Are they on their own personal quest? What is their goal? And what stands in the way of it? How can you play with those factors? So you say it's a short fantasy. Okay. You have a lot You have a lot of short fantasy stories are quite rare. And for good reason, in my opinion, because I think they're very challenging to write. But yes, you need to understand. Well, yeah, let's first discuss, what is your characters, what do they want? Vesper, what does your main character want above everything? What is their fundamental goal? And do they know that that's their goal? That's fair. What is their want? What is their need? That's going to be your first step, especially in a fantasy story. Especially in a fantasy story. What is their want? What is their need? How do those two things oppose each other? Is it a love story? Why is it a love story? Sorry. Yeah, so figuring out your want and your need is going to be one of your first steps if you're doing a character-driven story. And if you're doing a plot-driven story, and you just see how the character reacts to the world, that can work, but you need a good reason why these things are happening. They still do need a motivation. Yeah, I would say so. That makes sense. I'll leave this hanging for a little bit as I talk about this. One thing I talk about. Okay, MC wants to be a hero. That's a pretty good reason. Okay? Yeah, it's very what's that board game people always tell me people always talk about? What's that board game that I know nothing about? What is it? Debutantes and Dolls? I don't know. But it reminds me of some kind of role-playing game one would play on a tabletop. Oh, I know, it's Cyberpunk Red. Anyways. No, sorry. No, I don't think that's it. Pathfinder? No. Invisible Sun? Either way. Okay. Now, here's your next step. They want to make the world a better place, right? They felt the need to step up and do something. Why? Why do they want to make the world a better place? Because your average person doesn't. Your average person doesn't want to be a hero. They want to protect those close to them. Your average hero is motivated not by a sense of goodness. That's one hole people can fall into, is a sense of doing something because it's the right thing. It can work, but rarely. Like even Frodo, even Bilbo have kind of the same motivation, in the sense that they weren't bringing the ring to Mordor to save the world. That's what they told themselves, but the reality is they wanted to bring the ring to Mordor because they were bored. They'd lived life in a small village and wanted to see the world and saw this as their opportunity. So, what is the actual motivation of your character, of your protagonist, to save the world in a sense? Are they bored? Do they want to see the world? Will they become disillusioned? Will they realize just how comfortable and beautiful home is, and then in an attempt to return to it, find they are fundamentally changed? This is literally what makes Lord of the Rings so compelling, is the characters didn't leave to save the world. They left to see the world for the first time, to know what the world is like. And they hated it. And then when they tried to come home, they found that home wasn't there. Or at least Frodo didn't. Because it was a place they could never go back to. So it makes Lord of the Rings really work. It's really beautiful, actually. I love it. Gonna take a big drink here. So the question to ask yourself is, what does your characters say they want, and what do they actually want? And two, What do they actually need? Which is a difficult question to answer. And you probably won't know what they actually need until a decent way in. But work off the want, work off the lie the character tells themselves, and you'll find it starts to spin up from there. Yes. Because as I said, one of the traps you can fall into is my character wants to be a hero. One of the stories was my stories where the hero gets home and says out loud, "This journey was exactly what I wanted and I had a good time." Probably around a table full of dice. One of the stories I worked on in recent memory was one where 4 characters started with a vision of their future. As children, they looked up to these heroes of the land. Because I do work in fantasy occasionally. They had these heroes of the land that they idolized above everything else. That their entire life they spent looking from below upwards at, and wanted nothing more than to be those heroes. To be the people that people turn to. For one character, it was the desire to be strong. As strong as they were, because she had spent her life oh so weak. For another character, it was the fantasy of being able to protect those close to them after they had already lost so much. For another character, it was admiration. It was the idea that when they walked into these small towns, the world stopped for them. And for another character, it was the dream of gratefulness, of when they save someone's life, and will put their hands on theirs and thank them in a more deeply heartfelt way than they've ever known. That's what they actually wanted. They didn't want to be heroes. They didn't want to save the world. They wanted these small things, and their characters ran in opposition to that, at least as children. The one who wanted to be admired was bullied. The one who wanted to be strong was crippled. The one who wanted to protect took actions regularly with abandon that would often hurt those around them, or found themselves in horrible situations which led to it. Situations where they were truly powerless. That no matter how strong they got, no matter how powerful they were, lives and well-being would almost inevitably be lost. And the one who wanted to protect people, who wanted that admiration, realized just how difficult it can be. Just how much of one's own agency has to be taken away to save someone, to truly save someone. Especially from themselves. And what they realized as the story went on was that these heroes, that the position of hero was one not of admiration, not of strength, not of protection, but, as Spider-Man once said, one of responsibility. One of infinite challenge. One of choices impossible to decipher. Places where there is no right move to make, but a move must be made nonetheless. And challenge after challenge took what they had spent their entire lives wanting to be, and slowly the vision of what a hero was crumbled underneath them. Naturally, my villain for this one was a foil to that idea. He was someone who wanted to save people against their will. with very little care. Someone who wanted that praise, who wanted everything all these characters had, who wanted everything all these characters had wanted. And it showed how dangerous a selfish mentality can be when it comes to a position of utter responsibility. So knowing what your character wants and what they need, what these characters needed was to realize that this position of hero, this spot in society, was not one to be... It's not a position one wants. It's not something one wants. It's a position of responsibility that someone has to do. And to choose it and to take it upon yourself is to put yourself in a situation that will cause you pain in ways you can't imagine, but that you have to do nonetheless, because it's the right thing to do. And then the idea of a character doing something for the right thing becomes so much more detailed and so much more layered. Especially when you ask what the right thing even is. So yeah. Sorry, that was a little rant on one of my own stories. Refreshing. That was a little rant on one of my own stories. I apologize for the huge segue there, but it was to make a point about want, need, and drive. Because I knew these things, because I knew who the villain was and I knew who the characters were, I was able to play them off each other in a back and forth. I was able to have them highlight each other and strengthen each other through their presence, and have my characterization of my protagonists feed into the characterization of my villains. Does that make sense? Because this is the thing that I've been waiting to talk about all stream, that I lightly brought up at the beginning. People know how stories work now, and they will start to autofill the blank. There's a few writers out there in the modern day which play with this in incredibly creative ways. Fujimoto, who writes Chainsaw Man, is a fucking, genius when it comes to letting you fill in the blanks. He'll introduce a character in a very similar way he'd introduced a character before. He'll introduce a character in a way that is traditionally going to lead to the next step. He literally is able to predict the interpretation of his story that most readers will have. And he takes advantage of this. This is how you get effective twists. But beyond effective twists, this is how you get effective shorthand. If you say that as he left his house, he couldn't help but notice just how green his neighbor's lawn was when compared to his, suddenly we know that he's jealous of his neighbor, and we can extrapolate that beyond the lawn. Maybe he's jealous of his car, his family. So next time you mention his relationship with his neighbor, you don't have to establish that he's jealous of these other parts. The reader will assume. Why? Because they've read a million stories like this. Because they've read stories where because he's jealous of the lawn, he's jealous of the house, he's jealous of the car. He's jealous of the kids, he's jealous of the wife. You can take the parts you don't say, because it's like jazz. It's about what you don't say. You can cut so much unnecessary fluff, and the pacing of your story can become so much snappier by taking away everything you're certain that the reader will know by the end of it. It can save you a lot of time. Not only can it save you time, it can make your writing sing, because you don't have to double down on your ideas. Especially if you're working within certain genres. Understanding what is implied in a genre is as important as actually writing within it. It allows you to play. It allows you to have fun, and it can take your work to the next level. It's why Terry Pratchett's work is so good. It's why The Simpsons jokes often work so well. It's why Chainsaw Man is the best anime/manga currently being made. Knowing what is implied with your work can allow you to play with what you actually do. Sometimes for satisfaction, sometimes for catharsis, sometimes for shorthand. But it just makes such a difference. Another drink. So yes, it just allows you to skip a lot in really satisfying ways. I think that's actually why the Dungeons and Dragons movie failed the way it did, because it didn't really understand itself. Well, no, it did. Actually, it understood itself too well. It didn't understand its audience. Its audience couldn't understand it because it worked with so much shorthand and implication, but the implication in shorthand was so specific to the genre of media that is Dungeons and Dragons. Stories within that medium they just have a rhythm. They have a way they're told. The same that any other story does. Knowing how to play with that is where you get interesting. That's how you get stories like Junji Ito. That's how you get truly great pieces of media. It's also where you start to face challenges and why certain things can be very impressive. Because if you're working with something truly new, God, you have to spend a lot of time establishing that. Especially if a differential from the norm is core to your story. That is borderline meaningless, but I hope that makes sense after everything I've said. I hope. It might not. If it doesn't, that's fine. We're in this together. Oh, thank you for saying that was great, Vesper. I'm glad you liked my little story time breakdown. But yeah, understanding, and that's kind of, oh good. That's kind of what I was talking about too, when I was saying like, making your story stand out. Playing with what the audience thinks is going to happen, what you've built up to, and twisting is a amazing way to keep your audience invested. It is a flawless way to keep your audience invested. Understanding why something is different and why things have changed this time keeps your story fresh, especially if you're doing that to your own work, which every writer, every great writer has eventually, you know, from Shakespeare to Fujimoto. You start to play with your own tropes and your own cliches, in a sense, which can only come from reading your own work. So we're back here. It doesn't matter what level of writer you are. It doesn't matter how good you are. It doesn't matter how far you think you've come. You need to read your own work. You're not going to have fun. I do. I like my work. Not 100%. There's a lot of changes I need to make on this current draft of this current project. Have to get them in by the 15th for my contract, I think. I should be working on that today. I will. I write best drunk. It's too bad I'm in the editing phase. Yes. What was I saying? But yes, in terms of like, how do I put this? Questioning your own styles, cliches, then the whatnot can help you play with audiences' expectations in interesting ways. Also, knowing yourself well enough and your own work well enough to strengthen your build-up. Junji Ito is actually really good at not being different than his previous works. His work is, I don't want to say formulaic, but it fits a pattern generally, to the point where it becomes a strength of the work. It allows him to be so much more creative, and one of the best instances or demonstrations of that is Uzumaki. So if you... Sorry, now I'm just ranting about stories I like and things I think are done well. Does anyone have any more, like, writing questions? Or things they might want advice in? Because, like, to speak on... but yeah, that's... all of this sort of comes to the point. But yeah, post your questions in the chat, and I'll try, and we'll see if we can get to them. If you don't have any, that's also fine. I can just rant. Knowing your own style... This would be the next level of finding your flow, is knowing how the audience reads you, would be the way to put it. Being able to read your work from the perspective not of you, the author, but of the audience, will be the next level beyond finding your voice. If you've found your voice, no matter what you are writing, it should flow. Unless it's raw out of ideas, in which case it won't. But if you have an idea of what you want to do for a scene, it will flow the second you begin writing. A twist villain, I assume that's supposed to be? What's a good way to add a twist villain? Without the twist itself being cliche. Well, first of all, the first thing I'll say is a cliche isn't a bad thing. They exist. A test on a cliche. Add a test on a cliche. A twist on a cliche. There we go. I figured it out. It's fine if you're typing one-handed. A twist on a cliche without itself being the cliche. Don't lampshade. That's be my advice. Okay, so this is something a lot of writers do, and it's crutch. If you are writing about how annoying it is when characters break the fourth wall, and you have your character break the... Okay, let me put it this way. If your character is breaking the fourth wall a lot, and then you have your character say, oh, isn't it so annoying when characters break the fourth wall? That's called lampshading. It's when you look at your own work and go, these are the flaws with it. Aren't they bad? Yeah, from a game design standpoint, saying the tutorial sucks does not make your tutorial not suck. That's a very good way to put it, James. What you have to do is make it fundamentally different. You cannot simply observe the existence of the cliche as you use it. So, like, a good example here is Evangelion. Neon Genesis variety. They did not simply say, isn't it messed up putting kids in robots, as the kids just did normal things in robots. They showed you. That was the whole point of the show, was showing you how messed up it is to put a kid in a robot, and showing how hard it is and how challenging it is. If your goal is to criticize a cliche, don't simply critique it. Write it. Write it realistically. Two characters fall in love off the bat. You know what one handled that one really well, actually? For all of its faults? Frozen. It just wrote it. Why would two characters fall in love that quickly? Oh, because one is manipulating the other and gaslighting them and trying to da-da-da-da-da. Great criticism of that trope, of that cliche. Actually write it from a character-driven standpoint, would be my advice. Do not simply look at the trope or cliche and say, damn, isn't that cliche? That'd be my advice. Okay, two conflicting drives with writing. If you're not writing the most interesting part of your character's life, why aren't you writing that? Two conflicting drives. You need to know the character's care. Interesting. That is an interesting question. Why are those conflicting? You need to know the characters. You're not writing. I see why. Yeah, you need to know the characters to care. Okay. Okay. This is a pretty good one to answer, actually. Because I find myself in a similar place, James. I too love domesticity. I love mundanity in my stories. I love the mundanity of stories, of just exploring a character. The best way you can get around that problem, I have found, is through a multitude of much more detailed techniques, is what I would say. So, how do I put this in a way that makes sense? There's a lot of ways to sort of deal with that issue, and one is narrative parallels, is one that I find myself going back to a lot. You can explore the mundanity and the depth of a character in the less interesting part of their lives and make it far more interesting by giving it a narrative parallel to the more interesting parts, if that makes sense. That will also allow you to explore how a character is changed, so it achieves a lot in the same time. Watching a character go home and talk with their parents is so much more interesting after you know the parents are dead, or if you know they die later. Suddenly, those words become treasured nuggets, and you want to listen to every piece of it, because as a reader, you know you're never going to hear it again. So that's what I mean by narrative. That's not exactly narrative parallels, but a more narrative parallel way to put it would be watching a character have a similar conflict on a smaller and more internal level as they are having on a grander scope. How are day-to-day lives? Honestly, yeah. Fuck. God, kill more parents. Watching a character deal with a customer can become more interesting if you watch them use those same techniques that they used to deal with said customer in a humble everyday situation that they later use in the story. It makes it feel like it's not wasted time to the reader. Okay, so when they say the most interesting part of their characters' lives, what they really mean is the parts that push them towards who they need to be by the end of your story. And those can be the smaller moments. Those can be the humble moments, is what I would say. I find myself using those a lot, actually. One example recently is I was writing a character who was emotionally tortured by himself. He had lost someone close to him very recently in the story, someone very close to him. And so what I wrote for this section was a multi-pages of schedule of just the day-to-day. And sometimes that meant taking things slow. So at the start, it was what time he woke up, how long he spent doing everything in the day, how long he spent sitting on his computer, how long he spent drinking, how long he spent doing XYZ, and that detailed work. And the audience becomes interested because it's different than how he was previously acting in the story. Give me a sec. Had to cough. Anyways. And I paralleled that with a similar technique used early on when that person was still around, to show the differences in behavior. That's what I mean by narrative parallels, putting your characters in similar situations, but with one or two key differences, and that can allow you to explore domesticity and the mundane while keeping it interesting. I assume that's what you're kind of asking about, unless you mean like, in terms of caring about the characters, like knowing their childhoods, in which case, like, I would avoid childhood flashbacks at all costs it very rarely gains you any ground, would be what I would say. Writing the setup of characters and keeping it hooky enough to get people to read to the good part. One good technique for that as well is to, how do I say this? Is to, I had it and then I lost it. Writing the setup of characters, keeping it hooky enough to get to the good part. Every step of a character's journey needs to be as important as the rest. If you're writing about it, if you think it's important, but it's boring, find a way to make it less boring. Find a way you could achieve that same character setup. I understand the in media res technique. I really get that. I find myself doing a very similar thing. I know where you're coming from. Yeah. And no, not everything can start that way. There's such a desire to get to where it is now. I was going to suggest, and this won't help you if in media res is such an issue, is non-linear storytelling can be an incredibly useful tool. But that's so popular right now. The biggest thing I'll say is like a scene of someone talking to their mother can be the most interesting scene in your piece if you make it the most interesting scene in your piece. No matter what you are doing in a piece, in any piece of work, play, script, movie, book, you know, you need to be achieving more than one thing per scene. You need to be advancing character and plot. You need to, as long as you are doing more than one thing per scene, don't worry about the scene being boring. Because as long as it is character driven or plot driven and interesting, and your characters are interesting, they will carry the scene for you. Even if you think it might be boring, I would get other people to read it first and see how they respond before you judge it as boring. Because often those scenes, they're not as exciting. They're not jaw droppers, but they can be some of the most intricate and well-written scenes. And they are the scenes, the chapters you need to spend the most time on because they are slower. So you will need to rely on your prose for those scenes, is one other thing I would say. You need to really strengthen your prose and have it be... There is prose in this world so good, they can make nothing seem fascinating. So strengthen your prose and trust that the character is interesting enough. And if they aren't, once again, we go back to character, is interesting enough to carry the scene on their own. There's also, like I said, narrative parallels can make things interesting. Non-linear storytelling. I'm just gonna write Columbo fanfics. Honestly, fuck, Columbo's great. What was I just saying? It is hard though. It is. And it's, I think it's it can be what holds people back is understanding that. Because what I am describing here right now, what James has tapped into here is core to the experience of being a writer. It can be one of the greatest struggles that everyone faces. Because you need... Your story is not all going to be explosions and spaceship battles. It's going to be two characters sitting and talking. This is why I say write realism first. And by realism, I really do mean two characters sitting and talking, having a dialogue where they have two different and opposing motivations. Not exciting ones, but different ones. write a dialogue where two characters want different things. That's one of your first exercises. No fantasy, no grand stakes. Humble day-to-day activity. Write that and see what happens. If you can do that, you're on the right track, is what I will say. Okay, what else do I have to talk about? I think I had another topic people wanted me to go back to. Nope. Have I ran out of things to say? Honestly, maybe. Oh no. Oh, and I feel as though I should say in media res, for those who don't know, is to start in the middle of things, which is a very popular modern storytelling technique. It's very strong and very stereotypical right now. It's where that meme of, I bet you're wondering how I got here, kind of comes from. And it's fun. It's a fun way to start a story. I know, right? It's because I'm just heavier into drinking and I don't want to say something stupid. What else interesting is there to talk about? But yeah, there's a lot of... How do I put this? One of the greatest things you can do for yourself as a writer, and this is advice every writer will give because it's good advice, is to read and watch and see the techniques that people use. See in media res, see these tropes. See... Oh, it is Pulp Fiction's a great story. But writing it was incredibly complicated. But it's complicated in an incredibly obvious way. It's actually a really good... Okay. There's a handful of stories out there which are so obvious with what they're doing that they become fantastic teaching tools. Pulp Fiction is definitely one of them. It is explicit and it wears its technique on its sleeve with pride. It is core to how the film works. It is a fantastic movie to learn how to write better. And there's a lot of projects like that where you can watch it and go, oh, I see exactly how they achieved this. I see the techniques that they used. Because achieving a goal in writing, whether that is making a fantastic villain, whether that is advancing a character arc, no matter what it is, will always require a complicated spider web of technique. No story props itself up entirely on a single well-executed writing technique. There will be an array of techniques. And if you are not regularly using techniques to enhance your writing, if you are simply saying, this is what happens, then this is what happens, then this is what happens, these two characters say this to each other, then this is what happens, you're writing something, and I hate to say it, that is probably quite boring. You need a complicated web of techniques. But you also don't want to over rely on them. You need your work to speak for itself. Antagonist runs into a random guy in the middle of the night. Okay. One thing I feel as though I should shade, which this does remind me of, but I don't know if this is exactly what you're talking about. A coincidence? Yes, you do have to strike a fine balance with your techniques, but you need to understand what techniques are at play. First of all, so watch and read if you want to write. It's essential to the experience. A lot of people think it's not, that one can simply start writing, but it can make your work so much stronger to go to watch something and go, oh, how they did that was brilliant. I want to steal 10% of that. Anyways, do the classic X-Files crime drama. Random guy in the middle of the night. That is so shockingly specific. Oh, the house start. I see. It's a good way of establishing stakes off the bat for your audience and immediately communicating what the story is about. If you're writing something long, I would avoid it. Something short, for a short story or a 30-minute to an hour television show, incredibly invaluable. I don't hate it. I've used it in a few horror stories I've written. I actually kind of turned it on its head in this one piece I was working on recently, where it sort of plays with it does that to play with the idea of who the protagonist is. It's still a work in progress, so, you know, grain of salt. Yes, I see exactly where you're coming from. Yes, it's the house start. I know what you're talking about. It's Law and Order. It's NCIS. The inciting incident that doesn't include the main cast. That's a really good way of putting it. Yeah, for longer stories, I would avoid it at the least, because you have a little more room to play. For short episodic stories, it works very well. Longer stories, it struggles because audiences have just come to expect getting to know our main characters at the start of the story. If you want to play with that can be super fun and super interesting. If you want to present what appears to be a main character, this is very my opinion, by the way. I have very little to back this up because this is so specific. If you want to present a fake main character, that could be cool. That could be really cool. I would do that. I would do that right now. That's a great idea. A fake main character, but it's just an inciting incident. Love it. Oh, fantastic. The issues that will come with some downsides. Your audience will start with a further distance from your actual main character, so you'll have to do a lot of work to earn their trust back, and B, their investment. That is something that can deeply hurt an audience's investment. It also fundamentally changes the focus of your story. It changes the focus of your story from your protagonists to your villain and the effect that your villain or your problem and the effect it has on the world. Meaning your audience will be more invested in the consequences of this incident than they will be in your main characters. If that's what you're going for, that's fine. This is why it works so well in episodic things, because the world and the characters are consistent, so they're already invested from previous instances of seeing them. If this is how you're starting something that's meant to be a standalone piece, it can be rough. And what I will say is, even for episodic pieces, the first episode rarely starts like that. If you haven't noticed, the first episode rarely starts with that kind of inciting incident. It usually feels entirely strange, because when you watch the show back, suddenly there's this episode that just starts differently from the rest. It's because it can hurt initial investment. So I'd be careful with it, would be my advice. It's a good way of raising the stakes off the bat, and I understand why you feel the need to do that, but try to instead using a combination of foreshadowing, I would say, and it really depends on the story too, how you get around that. Because essentially what you're trying to do is hook people off the bat, and start with raised stakes. I get why. especially with attention spans. I don't want to say modern attention spans, because people have always had horrible attention spans. But yeah, I see that. My advice in that case is to find alternative methods that can raise the stakes off the bat. What's a good recent example of getting... Okay, you know what I can pull from, actually, is the first Spider-Verse movie is very good, obviously. Into the Spider-Verse, the first Spider-Verse movie. And what it does is use narrative parallels, like I was talking about before, where the stakes are not initially, how good of a Spider-Man will Miles be? But how is his performance in this new school? That is the initial stakes that they become invested in. So find the story, find the stakes of the story that you will later be using, and then find the character that those stakes need to drive, and then think about what else would have a similar effect on a smaller scale, would be my advice. That gives you instantaneous stakes on the domestic level that allows you to explore your characters. And still gives you room, still gives you somewhere to go. One joke I always make is that there was this old like Disney commercial or like some kind of children's show commercial where a character, some little girl was just like singing and she sang her full fucking heart out. And she stopped for just a second and another character screams at her, "Give yourself somewhere to go." And that means you need to give yourself room to increase your stakes later. So yeah. There are costs. And understanding how an audience feels about your story and the direction you're taking it can also allow you to play with your stakes and audience investment, as we've already said. If you establish a specific direction and then put a twist on it, the audience investment won't be internal then. It no longer exists entirely within the world. So a good example of this, what's a good example in recent memory? It's hard to find one. But essentially saying, oh, actually, you know what? Centaur World. I'll use that one. You start your, but that kind of fails due to marketing, so I won't use that. You start your audience by telling them this is gonna be a crime drama. And then you flip that on its head early on in the story. The audience is no longer simply invested in the plot. They're invested in what the fuck you're doing. Does that make sense? They become invested in the structural existence of this story itself, which is an incredibly powerful tool. And critics love it. Critics love it when they get to feel smart. They love it so much. It's so easy to make them feel smart. Same with publishers. They think they're so clever. Either way, playing with that can be a tool unto itself. So that comes down to, once again, what we were talking about, cliches and patterns within stories, and finding ways to twist and turn those in ways that can benefit audience investment. That's a more delicate game you're playing at that point, is what I will say, because you run the risk of doing something so different that they get lost. So that's when test readings come into play. And one piece of advice I would really give to everyone is there are places online where you can have your work read for you, and you pay, it's a service, and they will give you professional criticism, and it is worth every cent. It helps. It helps. Because friends and family will only take you so far. My best work has been done in professional workshops where I was hired by companies to write a certain piece, and then they would present it and workshop it with me in the room. That's when I've done my best work, because the opinions and the feedback that I received were on the grade I needed to, which sounds unfair because, you know, professional writers get that for free. but they've earned it. So paying for it in the beginning is a useful tool. The last and most important piece of advice. No, I have a few more. I have a few more pieces of advice. 1, your first draft is gonna suck. Don't go back. You'll never make it. You're trying to run a perfect marathon. Do you start it over every time you make a mistake? No. The whole thing? No. You finish the marathon and you get better, and then you do it again. And you finish it, and then you do it again. And you finish it, and then you do it again. And you finish it. And eventually you aren't out of shape. Eventually you're a better runner than ever. That is how you finish a marathon. You don't start over, because you can learn a lot by just keep going. It's not speedrun rules. Writing a novel or a play or a script is not speedrun rules. You don't restart every time you make a mistake. You finish it and then you take a look in the editing. 2, keep your editing brain and your writing brain very separated. I achieved this with alcohol. There's other ways. I don't know what they are. I've never tried to figure them out. What I do works for me. Well, as Hemingway once said, write drunk, edit sober. But you need to do them separately. If you stop writing and start editing, you've already made a mistake. You're already going backwards. You're already restarting that marathon. If you don't finish chapter 1 and you go back, erase the whole thing and start over, you're never going to make it to chapter 2. Ever. Ever. You will live in chapter 1 for the rest of your life, and you'll hate every step of it, and you'll never make anything at all. I'm being brutal, because I've seen far too many artists kill themselves in this. Not literally, metaphorically. Second piece of advice. Is there anything more important than that? Oh yeah, right. That's the biggest piece of advice I'll give you today. Everything I've said is meaningless if you don't write what you want to write. Parallels, narrative parallels, yeah, maybe I'll use that in 5 years when I actually get to it. But you have the time. Write a little bit every day. Sit at your computer and write for just a bit every day. It'll help. It'll get you further. If you're not writing, you're reading. Or watching something that advances your skills. That's acceptable too. Sometimes you need a light day. But try to get a little bit every day. Even if it's a single sentence. Even if it's one word. That makes it better. That advances. As long as you're advancing every day, then you're doing good. No matter how bad or how good your writing is, you're doing great. And I'm very proud of you, because that's the hardest part. And it is the hardest part. But if you stick to that, you'll do great. You'll do great. Genuinely guaranteed that you will do great. If you write every day, you'll probably do better than I will real soon. Because I don't even stick to that policy. But at the very least, write when you can. Sincerely. It's terrifying and it's scary and it rips your heart out. But if it's what you want to do, do it. If you have something you want to say, say it. You're doing no one any good by keeping it all to yourself. Because the last thing I can promise you is that you do have something to say. It's probably pretty important. If it's something that stayed in your mind for years and years, you probably have something to say. Something you need people to hear. Something people need to hear. And you're being very selfish by keeping it to yourself. So get it out there. For your sake and theirs. And I guarantee you that if you take the time, you do your exercises, and you find your voice. If you find your voice, find out what you have to say, and then say it, you'll have made a piece of literature better than half of all published novels. I can say that with almost utter certainty. As long as you follow those tenets. Find your voice. You'll know when you found it, mostly. You'll feel it. You'll feel it as you write, mostly. You'll be wrong, but you'll also later realize you were wrong. So you'll get better, because your voice is never done. But you will start to find it. And as long as you are saying something that hurts you to say, comes from your heart, and makes you wonder if people will like you less for writing it, or not like you less, will look at you the same way. And lastly, as long as you actually do it, once again, you'll get there. I promise. I genuinely promise. Anyways, it's been 2 hours. I've had a little too much to drink, and I think I'm ready to get to work. So, without further ado, it was so nice to see you all, and I hope, no matter where you are in the world, you have a grandiose morning, a larger-than-life afternoon, and an enormous evening. And of course, as always, a good night.